And now we're ready to go ahead and prepare the carburetor to seal to the motor. As you can see, as this motor came out of the box, it did not have the crushed screw assembly needed to fix the carburetor onto the motor itself. So in a package, we can see that we do have that assembly along with the manifold gasket. So we're going to take that carburetor assembly out. This is very common amongst all motors. They usually have one through screw that clamps on, that has aluminum clamps that actually hold the carburetor in place. So one side will have threads. The other side has a through boss. It's very important that you keep those in the correct orientation. And even though it does have O-rings, the clamps do have O-rings, we're still going to go ahead and seal those up because O-rings themselves, sometimes they can get chafed leading to an air leak. It's just better to use a little bit of sealant to rule that out. So we're going to go ahead and prepare these with some sealant. Okay, now we have the carb clamp. What we're going to do is put a little bead of sealant around the O-ring. Just a nice thin film to cover the O-ring. And you can see I'm actually using the screw to hold it, which makes it quite a bit easier. So now that I'm done with that, I take the screw out. Then I'm going to take this piece, the carb clamp, insert it into the other side here. Making sure that the cutouts for the carburetor are relatively aligned into the intake port. The final step for the carb clamp is to put a small dab of sealant on the end of the screw and install it into the carb clamp. You're going to leave this extremely loose, only thread it in about 1 or 2 times. And now you're ready to install the carburetor into the motor and tighten it. Now we're going to prepare the carburetor to be inserted into the case. I'm going to put a decent amount of sealant on the end of my blade. And what I'm going to do is distribute it right around the lip of the carburetor mating surface. And you do want to make sure that you don't let any of the sealant enter into the carburetor venturi, the opening at the end. So once I make sure that I have a decent amount of sealant all the way around, the carburetor is now ready to be installed into the motor. So what you're going to do is, since both of the slots of the carburetor clamp are aligned, you can see in the intake port your screw is ready to go. I already went ahead and did the other carb clamp, so that's ready. I'm going to take the carburetor and I'm going to twist it in while pushing down. And then you can see I'm taking my thumb here to make sure that it's bottomed out. Notice I'm rotating the carb just to make sure nothing's hanging up, and I want to verify that it is bottomed out. And I can see the bead of sealant just around the base of the carburetor. So now that I'm sure that that has been bottomed out into the case, I'm going to go ahead and tighten it up. One trick with this is you want to get it snug first, and then you want to go 180 degrees, half a turn of torque on the screw. Now once the carburetor is installed and the screw is secure, I'm going to put a decent amount of sealer again on my X-Acto blade, and I'm just going to lay a nice bead over the screw area. And let that set up and cure so that it doesn't drip. You really want to be careful after you seal both parts that you don't grab the motor on either side, obviously, because the sealant is still wet and hasn't cured yet. So that is the completion of the installment of the carburetor onto the block. Okay, one thing to pay close attention to is you can see how the carburetor is slightly twisted. That was actually intentional because on the low C8 you do want to leave a little bit of clearance for the center diff mount so that it doesn't chafe or puncture the carb boot, which can lead to other tuning problems. So usually what I would like to do is establish a measurement so that I can duplicate this angle of the carburetor on several different motors. And you can see I'm actually going from the inside of the spring post here on the block to the closest distance of the carburetor. And when I do that, I end up with about 1.16 inches. This is just a good way that if you ever have to disassemble your motor or take the carburetor off for servicing, that you can reset it at the exact angle without the linkage being bound up. So it's just always good to measure that and record that measurement. Now that the carburetor has been installed, we're going to go ahead and orient the fuel line in its correct position. Some cars actually have the fuel line loop around and up, but with the low C8, it actually is fed from the bottom. So using a 7mm wrench, what I'm going to do is to position the fuel nipple in its proper position. With my thumb, I'll stop the nipple from turning, and then I'm actually going to snug it down pretty firmly. You want to be careful. The fuel nipple has to be tight, mainly to prevent any damage that if a car were to come in, another car, and hit it, it can actually knock this loose. I've seen this come loose quite a few times, and your tuning goes all out of whack. So you do want to snug it up pretty tight, but of course you don't want to break it because this is only brass and it's threaded into aluminum, so you really want to be careful. Now that we have the carburetor installed onto the motor, what I like to do is to measure the actual carb settings as delivered from the manufacturer. This can be quite useful if you ever put a new piston and sleeve in the motor, you rebuild the motor, and you want to bring it back to its factory settings for a rich break-in. It's also very good too, as you begin to tune the motor, you can keep track of your settings and record them at different altitudes, different tracks, and you'd actually be pretty amazed at how well the motors respond to even 0.10 millimeters. It's a pretty drastic change. So measuring the low speed needle, you can see here I'm using my depth gauge. I'm going to rock it back and forth, keeping a little bit of tension on the wheel, and you can see that I have a low speed setting of 0.1 or 0.51 millimeters in from flush. So I would recommend writing that number down, that measurement down, for a quick reference. And then also you can see here the high speed needle actually sits out from the flush position. I'm taking a couple measurements to kind of take the average. So you're roughly about 0.6 millimeters out from flush. And again, this is very, very useful for keeping track of your settings as you break the motor in. It's always good to write these down and have these available for quick reference. If you ever become lost tuning, you can always revert back to the factory setting. Okay, the final step will be putting your chassis manufacturer's air filter onto the motor itself. This is a Losi 8 2.0 filter. So since we've double checked the carburetor, everything has been sealed, everything's been correctly tightened, I'm going to place the air boot onto the carburetor. I'm going to make sure that it's bottomed out as far as possible, and that it's also positioned correctly to drop into the chassis. The next step would be to take a small zip tie, place it around the neck of the filter, or the air boot rather, and secure it tightly. I always recommend running 2 zip ties in case one were to fail, but unfortunately this carb neck is a little bit short, so we're just going to go with 1 to make sure that it's tight. Okay, so there you have it. The last thing to do is to put the air filter on. You can notice the color of the air filter. It's very uniform, a very light color, a light blue. You definitely want to take a rag, and if you're using any pre-oiled filters, you actually want to try to squeeze as much of the oil out as possible, as they usually come a little over-oiled. It's not a bad thing. You just want to make sure that you dab it dry to a point of a nice uniform color. Install your cap. We've now installed the air filter element and the cover onto the air filter assembly, and that pretty much finishes up the sealing of this motor. Just to recap, what we went over was we sealed the back plate. We made sure that upon installation the back plate's arrow was pointing up. At that time that we installed it, we made sure that the piston was up so that it did not interfere or damage the piston. We removed the head, the heat sink, the combustion chamber and its shims, and we laid the shims out so that we can record the measurements of the shimming and document those just so that you have those for quick reference. We then moved on to the sealing of the carburetor, in which we sealed both carb clamps and the actual clamp screw itself. We also went over how to position the carburetor properly for the chassis. In this case, the Losi, which the carb is slightly turned. We went over how to measure that so that you can record that setting, that measurement for quick reference if you ever have to change carburetors or if you're just happen to be sealing up another motor. Now that the sealing of your motor is complete, I always recommend that you use dust caps whenever storing the motor. Even the slightest amount of dust that can enter into these openings can wreak havoc on the stability of your tuning. So all in all, this is how you should properly seal your motor when it's new or whenever you're servicing the motor itself, putting in new bearings, piston, or sleeve. Thank you very much.